We're here to introduce someone very special, and Bernie Sanders began his political career in the 1960s demonstrating for civil rights and racial equality. His first position as an elected official came in 1981 as mayor of Burlington, Vermont, a contest he won by 10 votes. And he went on to serve 3 terms as mayor of Vermont's most populous city until 1990, when he was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives, where he served for 16 years before being elected to the U.S. Senate in 2006. All of this as an independent, by the way. In the Senate, he's been appointed as the ranking minority member on the Senate Budget Committee, the Committee on Environment and Public Works, the Committee on Energy and Natural Resources, the Committee on Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions, and formerly chaired the Committee on Veterans Affairs. In May 2015, Senator Sanders launched his campaign for the Democratic nomination for president and surprised everyone by the overwhelmingly huge response of his progressive message. In August 2016, Sanders founded an organization titled Our Revolution, which is dedicated to educating voters, opening up the political process, and recruiting and supporting candidates for local, state, and national office. And I know that some of those candidates are probably here tonight, and that is something to look forward to in this confusing and emotional time. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, United States Senator Bernie Sanders.
Thank you, Charleston. Thank you. It is an honor and a privilege to be here with you tonight. When about a month ago or so, along with MSNBC, I had wanted to do a town meeting in McDowell County.
Yes.
And we made, MSNBC made the process of making all the arrangements. And I said, well, if we're going to go to West Virginia, let's go to Charleston and do something with the book. And the publisher, to be honest with you, was a little bit dubious. And said, well, you know, West Virginia is not our strongest place to sell books. So maybe we can get a few people out. Well, this is quite a few people. In fact, we have done a number of these book events. I could be wrong on this. I don't think there's been any event that had more people out than we have here tonight. So 2,000 people. West Virginia, thank you very much. And while I'm at it, I may as well also thank you for allowing me to win the Democratic primary hereby. Thank you. As some of you may know, in terms of the town meeting we were supposed to have tomorrow morning in McDowell County, it appears somewhere along the line that somebody made a decision that we could not use the armory that MSNBC had secured. Don't know how it happened. But let me tell the people who did that, if you think we are not going back to McDowell County to hold that town meeting, you are very mistaken. We're going to be back. And the reason we are going to go back is I was there during the campaign, and we held a very moving town meeting. You know, during a campaign, you hold hundreds and hundreds of meetings, but that's one that was memorable for me. Because as all of you know, that part of the state, part of the country has a whole lot of problems in terms of high unemployment, in terms of very serious opiate addiction, schools not adequately funded. But I was enormously impressed by the dignity and the courage of the people there who stood up, who talked about the issues, who talked about a new future. And that moved me very, very much. We are going back to McDowell County. And the reason we are going to go back is that here in West Virginia, in my state of Vermont, and all over this country, we are struggling with an issue that does not get the kind of discussion that it desperately needs. And that is, how does it happen that in the wealthiest country in the history of the world, 43 million Americans are living in poverty? And I think it is time we end sweeping that issue under the rug, that we bring it out in the public eye, we discuss it, and we make a determination to address the issue of poverty in this country. In America today, 20% of our children live in poverty. That is the highest rate of childhood poverty of almost any major country on earth. In McDowell County, the number is over 70%. We live in a nation in which we have more income and wealth inequality than any major country on earth. A nation in which the middle class is disappearing, and almost all new income and wealth is going to the top 1%. Our job together is to create an economy that works for all of us, not just a handful of billionaires. I want to talk about the book tonight. I hope you all enjoy it. I think it is, if I may say so myself, a pretty good book. But before I do, I suspect that one or two of you have something else on your mind. You want to know what the hell is going on in Washington. So let me say a word or two on that. As some of you may know, Donald Trump won the presidency. And he did very well. He did very well in your state and many other states throughout this country. And I want to tell you why I think he did as well as he did. Now, we should back that up a little bit and appreciate that he lost the popular vote by almost 3 million votes. But he did win the Electoral College, and that's just the fact. And I think the reason why Trump won has less to do with Trump, who was, according to all of the polls that I have seen, the least popular candidate in the modern history of America. It has less to do with Trump than it does to do with the fact that the Democratic Party has not been clear about which side it is on. There was once a time under Franklin Delano Roosevelt, even Harry Truman, when if you went out to any state in this country, went out to Vermont, went out to West Virginia, any place, and you asked the average person, you said, which party is the party of the working class of America? The overwhelming majority of people would have said, of course, it's the Democratic Party. But over the years, what has happened is that big money and corporate interests in Wall Street have had a significant influence, not just on the Republican Party, but on the Democratic Party as well. And I think the result of that is somebody like a Trump comes along and he says, you know what? I know that you are hurting. I know that you can't find a decent paying job. I know that your job may have gone to Mexico or China. I know that the cost of health care is too much for your family. You can't afford child care. And I, Donald Trump, I'm going to take on the establishment, the Democrats and the Republicans, and I'm going to create a government that works for the working class of this country. Now, the truth is, it's a good speech. The bad news is he never meant a word of it. Many of the problems that he identified were real, but as we can see week by week in his presidency, he has no intention, shamelessly lying about what he intended to do, but he has no intention of carrying out the policies that he talked about. When he ran, some of you will remember, he made a very powerful statement, and he said, and I'm paraphrasing a tweet, I don't know what that is about. But he said to the effect, he said, look, I am the only Republican running for president, this was during the primary, who will not do what the other Republicans want. They want to cut Social Security, they want to cut Medicare, they want to cut Medicaid. I, Donald Trump, I am not going to do that. Well, I suspect that a heck of a lot of senior citizens and working people here in West Virginia and all over this country, they said, well, that's it. He's right. We can't cut Social Security. How we make it? We can barely make it on $13,000, $14,000 a year. Can't cut Social Security. Medicare's working pretty well, but can't cut that. Can't cut Medicaid. I'm going to vote for Donald Trump. Well, it turns out that shortly after the election, he appoints people to the head of Health and Human Services, points people to be head of the Department of Education, points people to... You have heard of Betsy DeVos. Okay. Appoints a guy to be head of the Office of Management and Budget, the OMB, whose entire career has focused on how you cut Social Security, how you cut Medicare, how you cut Medicaid. So let me do tonight what I have done numerous times, and that is challenge President Trump to keep his word. Send out an email. Send out an email today, Mr. Trump, to your Republican friends who, as we speak, are developing legislation to make drastic cuts in Social Security, to privatize Medicare, massive cuts in Medicaid. Send out a tweet telling them that you will veto any legislation that cuts Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. I challenge you tonight to do that. Now, I may be wrong. I don't think you will see that tweet. See a lot of tweets on the ratings dealing with Celebrity Apprentice, that you may get. But you will not get a tweet from President Trump telling the American people that he intends to keep the promises that he made during the campaign. And then there's another area. He said, you know, I am going to clean the swamp. That's a good expression. I'm going to go to Washington, get rid of all them lobbyists, these big money interests, and I am going to represent the working people of this country. Great rhetoric. Well, he has a funny way of taking on the establishment. He's already appointed half of Wall Street to his financial team. The president of Goldman Sachs, a guy named Gary Cohn, just an ordinary working stiff who left. He recently left Goldman Sachs, got a nice paycheck, severance package of over $250 million to become the head of the economic financial team of President Trump. And he's appointed other people from Goldman Sachs, other people from Wall Street. In fact, Trump's cabinet consists mostly of billionaires and millionaires and is the wealthiest cabinet in the history of this country. So much for cleaning up the swamp. That swamp has multiplied in Washington. Yes, he did. He lied, and he lies a lot. And one of the difficulties that we have, and let me say this very seriously, is that in a democracy, people disagree with each other, and that is the essence of what democracy is about. I have many Republican friends who are very, very conservative. They believe what they believe. They're not liars. But when you have a president making delusional comments, when he makes a comment that 3 to 5 million illegals voted in this last election, that is totally delusional, and it is not backed up by one scintilla of fact. And it seems almost every day there is another statement coming out. It seems to me that two things, a lot of it is going on in Washington now, but there are two major things that I see happening. Number one, President Trump is trying to create a climate of fear from one end of this country to the other. And what he is doing is what demagogues have always done, and that is to pick on minorities and try to divide this country up. What a real statesman attempts to do, what good government is about, is bringing people together to see how we improve life for all of us. What demagoguery is about is trying to divide us up, trying to get the majority to hate people who are in the minority. And this, by the way, started long before Trump began his campaign for president. It started when Trump became a leader of the so-called birther movement, which was a racist effort to undermine the legitimacy of the first African-American president in our history. It wasn't that he had a disagreement with Obama on this or that issue. That's fine. That's democracy. I had differences with President Obama. This was essentially appealing to a group of people who held conspiratorial thoughts to suggest that Obama was not born in America. And then he went on at the very beginning of his campaign. Very beginning, he said, I, Donald Trump, I saw Muslims in New Jersey celebrating on a rooftop when 9/11 occurred. I saw it on television, he said. Problem is, nobody else in the world saw it on television. Nobody. And then he said, early on in his campaign, that people from Mexico who had come over the border were rapists and criminals. So what this whole pattern is about is trying to divide us up and say, look, life is tough for you. I'll tell you why it's tough. It's because of the Muslims. And you have other problems. I'll tell you what the problem is. It's a problem of the Mexicans or somebody else. And this is what demagogues always do. We're supposed to beat up and attack and hate minorities. Well, the antidote to that, and what we must do as a nation, is embrace minorities, bring them into our political and social system. I don't have to explain to anybody in this room who has studied history for 5 minutes to know the challenges and the pain and the very, very rocky road that this nation has traveled from when the very first settlers came here and did awful things to the Native American people. And from then, and are still doing terrible things to the Native American people. And a lot of that was done because the people who came over felt they were a superior race, and you could do anything you want. And then we don't have to go at great length about the abomination of slavery in this country and the Jim Crow laws that followed, and the fact that African Americans were denied the right to vote, that kids could not go to decent schools. I don't have to remind anybody here that 100 years ago today, women in America did not have the right to vote. I don't have to remind anybody about the struggles of the gay community in their struggle to be treated with respect and dignity and be able to marry. And I don't have to remind anybody in a state that gave birth to the United Mine Workers here and the extraordinary work they did, and the fights and the struggles that they went through to create dignity and decent wages for the coal miners, all of the struggles that workers and unions went through in order to make sure that people had decent wages and decent working conditions. That is the struggle of America. And I don't have to remind you that when the Irish came over here, there were signs, Irish not wanted, and the discrimination against the Italians and the Asians and the Jews. That is our history. But we have and should be very proud that we really have come a long, long way during that long and rocky period. And that the vast majority of the American people, especially this younger generation, who has heard what Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said, and that is, we do not judge people by the color of their skin or where they come from, but who they are as human beings by their character. And our job by the millions is to tell President Trump, You are not going to divide us up. You are not going to try to make us hate people because they have a different accent than we do. We have gone through too much as a nation to go backwards. We're going to go forward. Now, while Trump brought forth an executive order that the courts, including half of the judges who ruled on it, were appointees of Republican presidents, understood was unconstitutional. While all that is going on, there is something else that is going on that we should be very, very cognizant of. And that is the attacks against the middle class and working class will continue to accelerate. What Trump and his friends have in mind is cutting Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, federal aid to education, but at the same time providing many hundreds of billions of dollars in tax breaks to the top 1%. So one of many provisions is the repeal of the estate tax. This is over $200 billion in tax breaks that goes exclusively to the top 0.2%. And Mr. Trump and my Republican colleagues can support those types of outrageous tax breaks, but when we remind them that children in America are going hungry, that people can't find affordable housing, somehow there is no money available for the needs of working people and low-income people. And our job is to change those priorities. When the top 0.1% now owns almost as much wealth as the bottom 90%, when 50 of the wealthiest people in this country own more wealth than the bottom half of the American people, when 52% of all new income goes to the top 1%, you know what? Billionaires and millionaires do not need tax breaks. It's the working families of this country that do that. Right now, we're involved in a very heavy-duty struggle that I think, in fact, we are going to win. And that is, as you know, President Trump and the Republican leadership, they have said, oh, Obamacare is terrible. We're going to repeal Obamacare. And some of us say, well, tell me, what is going to happen to the 20 million people who lose the health insurance they gain from the Affordable Care Act? What happens to the many millions of people who have pre-existing conditions, have serious health problems, which before the Affordable Care Act often prevented them from getting any insurance, or certainly insurance at a reasonable rate, because the insurance companies could discriminate against them? What happens to women who will go back to being a discriminated class of people, a pre-existing condition, because they might actually have a baby? What happens to the people under 26 years of age who are on their parents' insurance? What happens to senior citizens who, if the ACA is repealed, will be paying $2,000 a year more for their prescription drugs and many of them can't afford to pay 10 cents more. What happens to somebody who has a chronic illness, a serious illness, a costly illness, who will then go back to where we were before the ACA and have the insurance companies put a cap on what the insurance companies will pay out? And when we ask our Republican colleagues, what are you going to do about all of that? They have nothing to say in response. And there is probably not more than 1 or 2 states in this country that have benefited more from the ACA than the great state of West Virginia. So if you see somebody on television talking about how terrible Obamacare is, how we have to repeal it, I want you to tell them this. Tell them that the overall uninsured rate in West Virginia dropped more than 10 points, going from 17% to 6% under Obamacare. That's pretty good. So that's only half the story. Seniors in West Virginia, Vermont, all over this country, they have Medicare. Among adults aged 19 to 64, before people get Medicare, in West Virginia, the uninsured rate fell a staggering 20 points to 9% from 29%. So before that terrible, awful Obamacare for people under 64, West Virginia had an uninsured rate of 29%, and now it is 9%. From where I come, those are pretty good results. Nearly 10% of West Virginia adults gained insurance through the Medicaid expansion. Almost 200,000 people in this state benefited from the Medicaid expansion. So to all of those people and more who voted for Mr. Trump, tell him to keep his word. Tell him not to cut Medicaid, Medicare, and Social Security. And what we are beginning to see happen is the American people are beginning to catch on to the Republican rhetoric, and they're looking at this issue pretty hard. Not so long ago, if you did a poll, most people would say, well, I don't like the Affordable Care Act. They would say that at higher numbers than those who said, I like the Affordable Care Act. That is changing. And right now, more Americans like the Affordable Care Act than dislike the Affordable Care Act. More importantly, somewhere around 15% of the American people want to repeal the Affordable Care Act. Simply repeal it. 85% say we either like it, keep it as it is, or make it better. Don't simply repeal it. And my Republican colleagues in the House and in the Senate are beginning to get that message. Republicans are now holding town meetings, and hundreds, or in some cases 1,000 people are coming out to these meetings, and they're saying to these members of Congress, sorry, my wife depends upon the ACA. It's life and death for her. You are not going to cut the ACA. And on February 25th, that is 2 weeks from yesterday, You are going to see hundreds of rallies outside of Republican district offices telling those Republicans, sorry, you're not going to throw 20 million people off of health insurance. And on that issue, my own view is and has always been that the United States must join the rest of the industrialized world in understanding that health care is a right, not a privilege. And I want all of you to know, who share that view, this is not a radical idea. I live 50 miles away from the Canadian border. They have had a single-payer health care system for decades. Every person in that country gets health care as a right. And that exists in the UK, it exists in Germany, it exists in France, it exists in Scandinavia. In fact, we are the exception to the rule. We are the only major country that does not guarantee health care to all people. We are the only major country that allows private, for-profit insurance companies to dictate policy. So our job now is to stop the Republicans from repealing the Affordable Care Act. Our job now is to strengthen the Affordable Care Act. That's our job today. Tomorrow, in my view, our job must be to pass legislation for a Medicare for all single-payer program. When we talk about health care, it is not only health insurance that we've got to worry about, because despite the gains of the ACA, 28 million Americans still have no health insurance, and many others cannot afford the high deductibles that they have. But when we talk about health care, we also have to take a very hard look at the greed of the pharmaceutical industry an industry whose greed is doing incalculable harm to millions of people. And the last statistics we have seen, in the year 2015, the 5 major drug companies made $50 billion in profit. 5 major companies. The 10 major executives in the pharmaceutical industry earn collectively over $300 million in compensation. Meanwhile, 1 out of 5 Americans under the age of 65, 1 out of 5, who goes to the doctor and gets a prescription cannot afford to fill that prescription. Seniors in Vermont and here in West Virginia cut their pills in half because they can't afford the cost of the medicine they need. This is disgraceful. Our job is to tell the pharmaceutical industry that they are going to stop ripping off the American people, stop charging us the highest prices in the world. Five companies should not be making $50 billion in profit when people in this country are dying because they cannot afford the medicine that they need. So where we are right now politically is the American people, I think, are beginning to wake up and confront the real dangers of the Trump presidency. the dangers in terms of moving us toward a more authoritarian society. Too many people in West Virginia, in Vermont, and throughout this country have put their lives on the line to defend American democracy. We are not going to move into an authoritarian society with one guy making the decision. And understand what Trump and his friends are trying to do. When he makes outrageous statements, such that 3 to 5 million people in this country voted illegally, totally fictional statements, what he is saying to Republican governors all over this country: continue to suppress the vote, continue to make it harder for poor people, or people of color, or old people, or young people to participate in the political process. Our job as people who believe in democracy is to make it easier for people to participate in elections, not harder. And when Trump attacks all of the media as fake media, what he is telling his supporters is, don't believe anything that they say about me. The only thing you should believe are the tweets that I send you. And when a judge, in my view correctly, rules against the executive order that Trump brought forth on immigration, a judge from the state of Washington who was appointed by George W. Bush, and Trump refers to him as a so-called judge, he is attacking the independent judiciary of the United States of America. So you can't trust anything that's in the media. If you can't trust anything that the judicial system does, I guess the only person that we can trust with our life and give him more and more power is Donald Trump. Sorry, Donald, that ain't gonna happen. Let me say a few words about the book. It's kind of why I was here in the first place. What the first half of the book is about, it talks a little bit about my growing up in a family that did not have a lot of money, and my learning at a very early age what lack of money does to a family and the kinds of tension that exist in a family and the kind of arguments that my parents had, because we simply just didn't have enough money to do the things that my mother wanted us to do. And the story that my family went through is exactly the story that many of your families and families all over this country are going through right now. And then I talked a little bit about my political career in Vermont. And I want to make this point because I believe, maybe the most important point that I can make to all of you this evening, is that democracy is not a spectator sport. I know that in West Virginia and all over this country, you guys love football and you love basketball. Unless you're out there on the field, it is a spectator sport and we enjoy it. But democracy is very different. What democracy is about in many ways, and I mean this very seriously, is honoring those people who gave their lives to maintain our freedom and our democracy. And we owe it to them to become deeply involved in the political process. Not somebody else, but you and you and you. And clearly, one of the major problems that we face as a nation is not just that our voter turnout is way too low and behind many other countries, but going beyond that. Too few people are deeply involved in the issues facing their communities, their states, or their nation. And what I talk about in the book is in 1971, a long time ago, the United States Senator from Vermont, his name was Winston Prouty, he died while in office. And there was a special election for 2 seats. The sitting congressman then, a guy named Bob Stafford, was running for the Senate, and then you had a House seat that was open. Vermont has just 1 seat in the House, so there were 2 seats. Well, I ran in that election for the U.S. Senate. For the first time in my life, I ran for public office, running on a third party. And on election day, I got 2% of the vote. A year later, there was a general election, and I ran for governor of the state of Vermont, and my vote percentage actually went down from 2% to 1%. And 2 years later, we have governor's elections every 2 years in Vermont. I ran for United States Senate again, and I got 4%. And 2 years later, I ran for governor, and I got 6%. Now, anyone who was smarter than me would have gotten the clue. You know, you run 4 times, the best you get is 6%. Give it up. But not being the smartest guy in the world, a few years later, I ran for mayor of the largest city in Vermont, Burlington, Vermont, and I won that election by 10 votes. After a recount. It's 14 votes, went down to 10. And 2 years later, I took on a Democrat and Republican. I was an independent. 1, 2 years later, took them on again. 1, 2 years after that, Democrats and Republicans combined, and we beat the combined parties anyhow. Now, why do I write that in the book? Well, A, it shows you that I'm not the smartest guy in the world, that I keep coming back. But also, it tells each and every one of you that success, whether it's in politics or just standing up and fighting, does not happen overnight. You gotta stay with it. And in fact, when I began my political career, Vermont was a rock-ribbed Republican state. Today, it is one of the most progressive states in the country because a whole lot of us did a whole lot of work. And that can happen in West Virginia, and it can happen in any other state. But it won't happen. It won't happen if you think somebody else is going to do it for you. So whether it means running for local school board or your local city council, or whatever it's called here, or your House of Delegates, or whatever it may be, get involved. So what if you lose? You'll win the next time. And let me just tell you this, I also know, and this is one of the things that is really, it troubles me. I talk to a lot of great people, and they say, Bernie, you know, I just don't know enough about education or economics or healthcare. You know, I just don't want to do it. Well, you know, I work in the United States Senate. And if you saw some of the guys in the United States Senate, your confidence in yourself would soar. So do it. Do it. Work with your friends. You know, if you don't want to run, get somebody else to run. But work on the campaigns, and it's not just campaigns. There are other issues out there. The truth is, bad things happen when good people do not stand up and fight. And that's what we got to change all over the country. And the other thing we talk about in the first part of the book is we started our campaign taking on the entire Democratic establishment with virtually no money and not knowing too many people outside of the state of Vermont. We started, you know, way, way, way in the wilderness. But then what happened is I started going around the country in order to make a decision. Is it worth running? I mean, if I run, I don't want to really do badly because it will look poorly upon the ideas that I believe in. Is there support to take on the political establishment? Is there support to take on the 1%? And we went all over the country, and suddenly we went out, we started off, 300 people came out to a meeting, went on, 500 people came out to a meeting, and more people came out. And I reached the conclusion that, in fact, the American people were sick and tired of politics as usual, sick and tired of the big money interests calling all of the shots, and people wanted real change. So we got into the race, and we worked really, really hard at it. And the way politics is in terms of the Democratic and Republican primaries, the first two states that come up are Iowa, which has a caucus, and New Hampshire, which has a primary. And what we knew is that if we did not do well in Iowa and New Hampshire, the media would write us off. We wouldn't be able to raise money. We'd be seen as a fringe candidate, and so forth. So we worked really hard. And this is what I learned in Iowa. We spent a lot of time in Iowa, which is a beautiful state. And we were able to have dozens and dozens of meetings just like this in rural Iowa, all over big cities. And what I learned is when you have an opportunity to talk to people about income and wealth inequality, about the need to fight sexism, about the need for a new trade policy, about the need to transform our energy system and combat climate change, about the need to create millions of decent-paying jobs by rebuilding our crumbling infrastructure, about the need to make public colleges and universities tuition-free, about the need to have a healthcare system that guarantees healthcare to all people. And when you go around the country and more people are coming out, they say, that's right. We are prepared to think big, not small. We are prepared to take on the top 1%. And as we campaigned around Iowa, we campaigned in New Hampshire, we went to other parts of the country, instead of hundreds of people coming out, thousands of people, and tens of thousands of people in major rallies. So what began as a fringe campaign, ignored by the major media, suddenly became something serious. And at the end of the day, we tied in Iowa, we won pretty big in New Hampshire. And that started the groundwork for the national campaign. And at the end of it all, taking on the entire political establishment, when I began, we had the support of one Democrat in the United States Senate, 6 Democrats in the U.S. House of Representatives, no mayors of any major city, not one governor. When we ended up with the endorsement of one major newspaper in the United States of America. We took them all on, and yet we ended up with 46% of the vote. And we won West Virginia by 16 points. But above and beyond all of that, something else happened. Truth is, and I can't explain to you why, we have some ideas, we did rather poorly among senior citizens. But what ended up happening is among people 40 years of age or younger, whether they were black or white or Latino or Asian American or Native American, we won that vote big time. And that meant to me then and it means to me now, that the future of this country is with us and with a progressive vision of what this country can become. So that's kind of what the first half of the book deals with the day-to-day politics of how you start a campaign for president, what you've got to do. And trust me, we learned an enormous amount every single day because we started knowing very, very little. But then what I do in the second half of the book is I ask some simple questions. And the questions are, what are the major issues and problems facing America? You know, democracy is not very hard to understand. And that is what it is supposed to be about, and in truth it doesn't happen all that often, is people come together here tonight, but all over the country, and they say, okay, what are the problems facing America? And how do we solve them above and beyond 30-second negative TV ads or talking points or insults, etc.? What are the problems? And I wrote them down. And I gave you, in this book, my views of the problem. And the first issue, to me, and this is, not too many people in this country talk about it, but I do, and that is the need to defeat oligarchy. Now, what do I mean by that? Now, this is something you're not going to see in the newspapers. But this is what is going on in America today as I see it. The way I see it is we have fewer and fewer extraordinarily wealthy people who control our economic life and, as a result of Citizens United, our political life as well. And that's what oligarchy is about. Oligarchy is when a handful of people have the power. They control the media, they control the political process, they control the economy. For example, you have a family, many of you know who they are, called the Koch brothers. You know the Koch brothers. And right now, this is the second wealthiest family in America. They're worth between $80 and $100 billion, one family. And for them, it is chump change to spend hundreds of millions of dollars trying to elect right-wing Republicans who represent the interests of the wealthy and the powerful. Chump change. What's a few $100 million when you are worth $80 to $100 billion? And that is exactly what they are doing today. So when we talk about where we are as a nation, our job is to revitalize American democracy. Our job is to overturn this disastrous Supreme Court decision on Citizens United. Our job is to move toward public funding of elections so that if anybody here wants to run for whatever office, you don't have to spend half of your life begging wealthy people for campaign contributions. So trying to revitalize American democracy and defeating the trend toward oligarchy is, to me, enormously important. No issue out there more important. And what we are seeing with Trump is, despite all of his rhetoric, as I mentioned earlier, his cabinet has more billionaires in it than any cabinet in American history. The poor guys are only worth $5 or $10 million. That is not a cabinet designed to represent the needs of ordinary Americans. Now, the next issue that I talk about is an issue also that has to be addressed, and where, in fact, the Democrats, by and large, have been pretty weak. And that is to talk about the decline of the American middle class. Now, the Democrats and I often say, and it is true, that the economy at the end of Obama's term was a hell of a lot better than it was when he first came to office. That's true. But there is another truth out there. And the truth is that despite the gains under Obama, there are tens and tens of millions of people today who are existing in incredible pain and despair. Here in West Virginia, in Kentucky, and many other parts of this country, for the first time in the modern history of America, people's life expectancy is going down. What modern history is about is a result of public health advances, as a result of improvements in health care. Generally speaking, we live longer than our parents, who lived longer than their parents, who lived longer than their parents. But right now, unbelievably, in America today, we have millions of people whose life expectancy will be lower than their parents. Now, why that is, people are writing books about it, but I think it has a lot to do with despair. It has a lot to do with a guy who once had a good job producing something, and then one day his job went to Mexico or China, and now he's working for 50% of the wages that he used to get. And he's making $8 or $9 an hour. And his kid will never be able to afford to go to college, and he's looking around in despair. And he and others, they're turning to opiates, they're turning to drugs, they're turning to suicide because of that despair going on all over this country. We have to recognize that reality. We got to step in and say to our fellow Americans that in the richest country in the history of the world, you and your children are going to be treated with dignity. You are going to have opportunity. Think about it. And these are the issues that need to be talked about, which is why we're going to go back to McDowell County. Just think about it. You are a single mother in America, and maybe you're doing okay. You're making $30,000, $40,000 a year. Do you know how much child care, good quality child care costs? It costs $10,000, $15,000 a year. How in God's name are you going to get your child good quality child care, which you want, which you need because you need child care for you to go to work? How do you do that and pay $10,000, $15,000 a year when you're making $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 a year? How do you do that? Put gas in the car, pay for your health care needs, pay your rent or your mortgage. How do you do that? Well, you don't. You are in pain and you are hurting. What happens if you are 55, 58 years of age in America today, and you are one of the 50% of older workers, 55 to 65, who has nothing, zero, in the bank for retirement? Put yourself in the place of a 60-year-old worker. You're going to retire in 5 years. And you got nothing in the bank other than the Social Security that hopefully the Republicans will not destroy. How do you feel? You are scared to death. You don't want to be dependent on your kids. You want to maintain your independence and your dignity. You got nothing in the bank because for the last 20 years, your wages barely kept up with your expenses. How do you feel if you are in Vermont or West Virginia and you get sick, but you cannot afford to go to the doctor because you got a $5,000 deductible? And I have talked to too many doctors in my state and others around the country who tell me that patients die. Patients walk into their office very, very sick. And the doctor said, why didn't you come to me a year ago when you first saw that lump, when you first felt that pain? And then people say, well, I didn't have any insurance, or I had a high deductible. And some of those people, because they walk into the doctor's office too late, some of those people die. We lose tens of thousands of people every single year because they don't go to the doctor when they should. How do you feel if you are sick today and you can't afford to go to the doctor? How do you feel if you have a bright son or daughter who studies hard and does well, who dreams of being the first in the family to go to college, as I was in my family, but you can't afford to send that kid to college? How does that feel? So yes, Democrats are right that we are better off today than we were when George W. Bush left office. But we are still missing a very, very significant point, and that is millions of people are living in despair. They are living in fear. And this should not be happening in the wealthiest country in the history of the world. That's the chapter, in a sense, deals with the decline of the middle class. And know this, that over the last 35 years, the Republicans don't tell you, you're not going to see this on TV. The mantra out there is, well, we have a large debt, which we do, something like $19 trillion, a lot of money, and therefore we got to cut programs for working families. What they do not tell you is that over the last 35 years, there has been a massive transfer of wealth from the middle class to the top 1/10 of 1%. That they somehow forget to tell you. And when we talk about revitalizing, rebuilding the middle class, one of the things we have to do is transfer that wealth back from the 1/10 of 1% back into the pockets of the middle class of this country. And there is a chapter called Ending a Rigged Economy. And essentially, what do we have to do? Well, let me just point out a few things that you have to do. For a start, in the United States of America today, people should not be working 40 or 50 hours a week and living in poverty. We have got to raise the minimum wage to a living wage, $15 an hour. In the United States of America, women should not be earning 79 cents on the dollar compared to men. We need pay equity for women. In America, our infrastructure, that means our roads, our bridges, our water systems, our wastewater plants, our rail system, our airports, our levees, and our dams are crumbling in many parts of the country. During the campaign, I went to Flint, Michigan, and it was one of the most difficult meetings that I've ever been to in my life, because my wife and I just met backstage with 7 or 8 people whose families had been impacted by lead in the water. And I will never forget, as long as I live, a woman describing what happened to her daughter, who had been a very bright, gregarious kid, doing well in school, but after drinking a lot of that lead in the water, ended up in special education, having a hard time remembering simple things. But it is not just Flint, Michigan. All over this country, there are communities struggling with clean water. Yep, I remember. Exactly. All right. So, what you do when you are the wealthiest country in the world, what you do when your infrastructure is crumbling, it doesn't take a genius to figure it out. You rebuild that infrastructure and you put 15 million people back to work at good wages. Think what this country looks like when we got people rebuilding our roads, our bridges, and our water systems, when we have people in all different kinds of jobs pitching in to give us the kind of infrastructure a 21st century people need. So, figuring out how we expand the middle class, raising the minimum wage, creating a tax system which is fair, which tells Donald Trump and his fellow billionaires that they are going to start paying their fair share of taxes. Moving, every psychologist who studies the issue tells us that the ages of 0 through 4 are the most important years in terms of human development. And yet we have God knows how many children all over this country who are not getting the kind of early childhood nurturing and education that they deserve. We can create a state-of-the-art, universal child care system in America. In my view, and it is not simply my view, it is the view of the almost unanimous position of scientists who have studied the issue, climate change is real, it is caused by human activity, and climate change is already causing devastating problems in our country and around the world. And what the scientists tell us is that if we do not transform our energy system away from fossil fuel, what we will be seeing, just think about it for a second, more drought, more floods, more extreme weather disturbances, more rising sea levels. We will be seeing more conflict around the world as people fight over limited natural resources. All right? Now, to my mind, what that means is when the scientific community is virtually unanimous, it seems pretty obvious to me, although not to President Trump, that it might be a good idea to listen to science. And to invest heavily in energy efficiency, in sustainable energies like wind and solar and geothermal. Now, I know and you know that when you transform our energy system, there are some people who are going to be hurt. Our job is to make certain that we protect those workers. It is not their fault. And that means we invest billions of dollars in rebuilding those communities, providing jobs and health care and education to people who may have lost their jobs as a result of that transition. In America today, we have the dubious distinction of having more people in jail than any other country on earth. We have about 2.2 million people. We're spending $80 billion a year at the local, state, and federal level locking up fellow Americans. China is a communist authoritarian country about 4 times our size. We got more people in jail than China does. Our job is to begin to get at the cause of why we have so many people in jail and understand we need real criminal justice reform. People in jail are disproportionately African American, Latino, and Native Americans. In my very strong view, it makes a hell of a lot more sense for us to invest in jobs and education, not jails and incarceration. Today we have about 11 million people in this country who are undocumented. The vast majority of them are working hard. They've come to this country to improve their lives and the lives of their children. Vast majority of them are not criminals, but hard-working people who often are paying taxes for benefits they will not receive. Instead of demagoguing this issue, instead of trying to minimize, instead of trying to hurt and isolate these people, it seems to me to be clear that we need to move toward comprehensive immigration reform and a path towards citizenship. In America today, we have millions of senior citizens and disabled veterans who are trying to get by on $12,000, $13,000, $14,000 a year Social Security. You can do the arithmetic as well as I can, and the answer is nobody, no elderly person, no person with a disability can make it on $12,000, $13,000, $14,000 a year. Bottom line is that a great nation is not judged by how many billionaires it has. A great nation is judged by the compassion it shows to the most vulnerable people in this country. And the idea that some in Congress want to give, dare I say, huge tax breaks to billionaires and cut back on the needs of the most vulnerable. That is not what this country is supposed to be about, and we must not allow them to get away with that. The last chapter in the book, and if you get bored somewhere in between, go to the last chapter. It deals with corporate media. And the essence of what that chapter is about, it's not just my experience with media, and I have a lot of experience with the media, but it is that the great failing of corporate media, and there are obvious reasons for this, is media does not talk about the realities facing the American people. You can watch television, as we say in Vermont, till the cows come home, and you will not hear a discussion about income and wealth inequality. You will not hear discussions of the greed of the pharmaceutical industry. You will not hear discussions about poverty, about homelessness, about the power of the Koch brothers and a handful of other billionaires on the political process. So our demand has got to be that the media stop focusing so much on political gossip and start talking about what is going on in the lives of the American people. During my campaign, I tried to do that, and I cannot tell you that we had a lot of success. I was followed around, as presidential candidates are, by 10, 15 media from all the major networks and newspapers, and I deliberately went to places like Pine Ridge, South Dakota. You know what that reservation in Pine Ridge is about? People in that reservation have a life expectancy equivalent to the country of Guatemala, a poor third world country. I went to places in California where fracking was causing serious health problems for people. I went to tenements and public housing in New York City where old people, because the elevators weren't working, old people could not even get down to shop. Those issues got very, very little coverage. And our demand of the corporate media is start dealing with the realities of American life. Okay, I think, Dan, we are ready for some questions. I think some of you may have written some questions, and here he is, okay.
Okay. Yes, we have some questions that thankfully you guys submitted. A lot of questions have been addressed in Senator Sanders' speech tonight. You know, he wants...
Which, by the way, went on about twice as long as I anticipated, but... I did.
Yeah.
But not usually at a gathering like this. I don't know. But, okay.
So a lot of questions have been covered. We had a lot of questions from people looking for advice about running for office, and a lot of questions about confidence and how do you overcome this. But
Okay.
I think you kind of...
All right, this is a very important issue. And the future of our country depends upon how we answer that question personally. What the establishment does, so I'll give you the answer, then you can ask the question. How's that? What the establishment does, in many, many different ways, is to tell you that you're not really smart enough or experienced enough or capable enough to get involved in politics. Leave it to other people. Leave it to the Koch brothers and their candidates. They'll take care of you. Needless to say, I hope we all believe the opposite. Politics is tough stuff. You're not going to win the first time out, perhaps, but it is important that you study the issues, you bring people together. In 2 weeks, my Republican colleagues are going to be very surprised, because in hundreds of places around this country, their constituents are going to be asking their members of Congress and their senators some very hard questions. The Women's March of a few weeks ago, where millions... Extraordinary. Extraordinary. My own state of Vermont, I never saw anything like it. We had about 15,000 people out at our state capitol. Millions of people all over this country. So the answer is, understand that there is an establishment that does not want you to be involved. Your job is to be involved.
That answer goes to Stephen Broadwater and the United States. Thank you for your questions. Here's a question that I think came from the Advocates for a Safe Water System. You mentioned Flint. In January of 2014, over 300,000 residents of Kanawha County were poisoned, and their water was contaminated by MCHM, a coal chemical. If you were a resident or official in Charleston, would you support or fight to make the water system publicly owned and operated, and how?
Is the water system here not publicly owned? Yeah, of course I would. I mean, water is a pretty basic necessity. We don't survive without it. We need to make sure that what we're drinking is clean. We need to make sure that people are not making profits off a very basic necessity.
Okay, we have a question from Valerie. West Virginia has the highest rate of overdose deaths in the U.S. If you were an ordinary West Virginian like us, what would you do to help our community recover?
Well, this is the tragedy, and I know that West Virginia has been hit hard by it, so has my state, and so have communities all over this country. And I touched on a little bit, I think the first question that we have to ask ourselves is why? Why are people turning to opiates and to heroin? In my state, I think it was last week, 3 people died in one small town from heroin mixed with God knows what. So we have a national crisis right here. But second of all, obviously, we have got to make treatment available to everybody who needs it, regardless of their income. Breaking an addiction is not an easy thing, but in the long run, from a human point of view, as well as being cost-effective, treatment is the very best approach. And it shouldn't have anything to do with how much money you have. All people should be entitled to break their addiction. And right now, there is no question, actually Vermont is beginning to do a pretty good job of this, but there is no question that we just don't have the kind of myriad of treatments that we need to deal with this national crisis.
Here's a question from Kimberly. It's a good one. Could you speak to people about the way to advocate that will make the biggest impact to their elected officials? What makes you listen to your constituents the most? Is it calling, writing, marching? Please share some strategies to help us work smarter, not harder, or even worse, turn into white noise to our elected officials.
Good question. The answer is all of the above, plus it does that. During the period when Betsy DeVos was being debated, the telephone lines in Washington, D.C. were overwhelmed. All right? Now, with the exception, and in fact, 2 Republicans were turned around, the senator from Maine and the senator from Alaska. And while the other Republicans did vote for DeVos, do not think that they were not shaken by the number of calls that they got, knowing that people felt very strongly about that issue. So I think emailing and calling and writing is very important. But I'll tell you something else. And again, I'm getting back to something we're working on right now on the 25th. And that is holding meetings. Organize the meetings yourself and invite your elected officials to discuss the important issue with you. If you have people who want to end the Affordable Care Act, invite them to a meeting where a few thousand West Virginians are there. Let's hear what they have to say. Bad decisions are made. Lobbyists win. The big money interests win when members of Congress think nobody knows what's going on. When you stand up and you fight back, we will make real change.
Here's a question from Steve about trade. He says, I'd like to question you about trade agreements. I've always thought that a trade agreement should include worker rights, environmental protections, and consumer protections. For instance, a cancer-causing pesticide that is outlawed in this country, if used on food grown in another country, should not be allowed. He goes on to talk about child labor pollution. He says, I read a little of the TPP agreement, and it seemed to deal with stuff like child labor, workers' rights, and environmental protections. What specifically was the problem with it, and what, in your opinion, would make it a good trade agreement?
I have voted, since I've been in Congress, against every major trade agreement. And I believe that was exactly the right thing to do. Now, we have lost, in in the last 15 years, 60,000 factories in America. Not all of it attributable to trade. But here are the objections, just two briefly with regard to the TPP. Number one, American workers would be forced to compete against people in Vietnam where the minimum wage is 50 or 60 cents an hour. And that's just unfair to American workers. Number two, there is a provision in it which says that that a company has the right to sue a government, local, state, or federal, if that government does something which hampers and lessens their future profitability. So, for example, if you're in a state and the state passes environmental legislation which will impact the profits of that company, that foreign company, they can actually go to a 3-person tribunal, international tribunal, and sue you and say, how dare you pass environmental legislation which cause us profits. The most obscene example, and it turned out okay, but the most obscene example was Philip Morris suing the country of Uruguay, tiny little country, because they worked hard on trying to prevent kids from smoking tobacco. And Philip Morris went to this tribunal and said, if kids don't smoke cigarettes and get addicted, our profits are hurt. We are going to sue. That was an extreme example of an absurd provision. Last question.
Last question. This comes from Luca and his mother. I'm a parent of an 8-year-old who's been to more rallies, protests, conferences, and marches in his short life than he cares to remember. My son was initially very happy, but after an hour or so, impatiently asked, "Can we leave yet?" So we were wondering, since my son and certainly other children are here tonight, can you take a moment to speak directly to the young people in the audience and give them some good advice about what they can do to help their parents, guardians, teachers, and community leaders make the world a better place?
Thank you. The answer is pretty simple. If you look at the history of our country, if you look at how workers were able to form unions and earn decent wages, if you look at how we did away with child labor, 150 years ago, children were not in school, they were in factories and in the fields. If you, in the coal mines, that's right. If you look at the struggle of women, not only to get the right to vote, but also to do the work that they want to do. If you look at the struggle of the African American community, decade after decade, people were lynched, were beaten, were jailed. But at the end of the day, because millions of workers stood up and fought for dignity for all, for women who stood up and fought, for the gay community that stood up and fought, we made real progress in America. The only way, Dan, and I believe this from the bottom of my heart, the only way that real change ever takes place is from the bottom on up, never from the top on down. So I say to those young people, we can be so much more. We don't have to have 43 million people living in poverty. We don't have to have kids who can't afford to go to college. We don't have to have water systems that are polluted. These are solvable problems. But in order to solve them, we're going to have to do one very big thing. Not easy. We're going to have the guts to take on a billionaire class whose greed is doing us so much harm. Let me just conclude as I begin. This has been a wonderful, wonderful meeting, and I want to thank all of you for coming out tonight. I hope you enjoyed the book. Thank you all.